Sarah Martinez stepped off
We
the
need to move
military
now.
transport bus at Camp
Stay
Pendleton,
sharp.
her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and her orders clutched in her other hand. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt, and she could already feel sweat forming under her crisp new uniform. At 22, she had just completed her basic training and military police school, graduating at the top of her class. But, standing here now, surrounded by seasoned Marines who barely glanced in her direction, she felt every bit the inexperienced rookie she was. The base buzzed with activity. Humvees rolled past in clouds of dust, drill instructors barked orders across the parade ground, and groups of Marines moved with the confident swagger that came from years of service. Sarah had dreamed of this moment since she was 16, when her older brother Miguel had been killed in action overseas. She had promised herself she would serve with the same honor and dedication he had shown, but now the weight of that promise felt heavier than her gear. "You must be Martinez," came a gruff voice behind her. Sarah spun around to find Sergeant First Class Johnson approaching, his weathered face showing the kind of skepticism she had grown accustomed to during training. At 45, Johnson had served 3 tours overseas and had little patience for what he called fresh meat. His eyes swept over her slight frame and youthful face with obvious disapproval. "Yes, Sergeant." "Reporting for duty," Sarah replied, snapping to attention and rendering a sharp salute. Johnson barely returned the gesture. "Great. Another college kid playing soldier. Follow me, rookie. Try to keep up." As they walked through the base, Johnson rattled off a list of rules and expectations, his tone making it clear he didn't expect her to last long. "This isn't some campus ROTC program, Martinez. This is the real deal. We've got actual responsibilities here, actual threats to deal with. I've seen plenty of kids like you wash out in the first month." Sarah bit her tongue, determined not to let his words rattle her. She had faced similar doubts throughout her training, from instructors who thought she was too small, too young, or too idealistic for military service. Each time, she had proven them wrong through sheer determination and an unwavering work ethic that had earned her respect, if not affection. The military police station was a concrete block building that looked like it had seen better decades. Inside, the air conditioning barely worked, and the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently. Johnson led her to a small desk in the corner, its surface scarred with coffee rings and scratches from years of use. "This is your workstation," he said, dropping a stack of paperwork onto the desk with a loud thud. "Start with these incident reports. File them alphabetically, and make sure every form is complete. Any questions, ask Corporal Williams." He nodded toward a lanky man in his 30s who was typing furiously at a computer. "And, Martinez? Don't screw this up. We don't have time to babysit." Sarah settled into her chair and began working through the reports, each one telling a story of life on a military base. Domestic disputes, minor thefts, traffic violations, and the occasional more serious incident. She read each one carefully, not just filing them away but trying to understand the patterns and procedures. This attention to detail had always been one of her strengths, even if it sometimes slowed her down. "You read every single word of those things?" Corporal Williams asked during a brief break, looking over at her still-growing stack of completed files. "Yes, Corporal. I want to understand how everything works here," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. Williams exchanged a glance with another MP, Corporal Foster, who was passing by with his own armload of paperwork. "Rookie thinks she's going to solve all our problems by reading old incident reports," Williams said with a chuckle. "Give her a week," Foster replied, not unkindly. "Reality has a way of adjusting expectations." Over the next several days, Sarah threw herself into every task assigned to her, no matter how mundane. She organized evidence lockers, updated computer databases, and even volunteered to clean the holding cells when the regular maintenance crew was short-staffed. Her fellow MPs watched her with a mixture of amusement and bewilderment. "She's like a machine," observed Corporal Peterson, a veteran MP who had seen dozens of rookies come and go. "I've never seen anyone attack filing with that kind of intensity." "It's not natural," agreed Williams. "Give her something real to do, and she'll probably fall apart." That opportunity came sooner than expected. On her fifth day, a call came in about a domestic disturbance in the base housing area. Sergeant Johnson was in a meeting, and the other available MPs were already on calls. Corporal Williams looked around the nearly empty station and sighed. "Martinez, you're with me," he said, grabbing his gear. "Time for your first real call. Try not to embarrass yourself." Sarah's heart raced as she followed Williams to the patrol vehicle, but she kept her expression calm and professional. She had studied domestic disturbance protocols extensively in training, but she knew that real situations were always messier and more unpredictable than textbook scenarios. The house was in a quiet section of base housing, but they could hear raised voices before they even got out of the car. A woman's voice was pleading, while a man's voice grew increasingly angry and belligerent. Williams approached the front door while Sarah positioned herself to his left, exactly as they had been taught. When Mrs. Chen answered the door, her eyes were red with tears and there was a bruise forming on her left cheek. Behind her, her husband Staff Sergeant Chen was pacing back and forth, his hands clenched into fists and his face flushed with alcohol and rage. "Ma'am, we received a call about a disturbance," Williams said in his most professional tone. "Is everything all right here?" "Everything's fine," Staff Sergeant Chen called out before his wife could answer. "Just a little disagreement. Nothing that concerns the MPs." Williams stepped into the house, with Sarah close behind. The living room showed signs of the little disagreement: an overturned lamp, scattered papers, and a framed photo lying face down on the floor with cracked glass. "Sir, I need you to calm down and step back," Williams said, his hand resting casually on his radio. "We're just here to make sure everyone's safe." Chen's eyes were bloodshot and his speech slightly slurred, but he was coherent enough to be dangerous. "Safe? Who said anything about not being safe? This is my house, my family. You have no right to be here." Sarah noticed Mrs. Chen flinch when her husband raised his voice, and she saw the woman's young daughter peeking around the corner from the kitchen, her eyes wide with fear. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and the terror on her face reminded Sarah of her own childhood, when her father had struggled with drinking after returning from his first deployment. "Sir, why don't we step outside and talk?" Williams suggested, but Chen was having none of it. "I'm not going anywhere. You want to talk, we talk here. And you can start by explaining why you brought a kid to do a man's job," Chen said, gesturing dismissively at Sarah. "What is she, 12? This is what passes for military police these days?" Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she maintained her professional composure. She had heard worse during training, and she wasn't going to let some drunk sergeant rattle her on her first real call. Williams tried to de-escalate the situation, but Chen was beyond reasoning. His anger was feeding on itself, and the presence of the MPs seemed to be making him more belligerent rather than less. Sarah could see the situation spiraling toward violence, and she knew that Williams was starting to feel it too. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah said quietly, addressing the woman directly, "why don't you and your daughter go into the kitchen while we talk with your husband?" The woman looked grateful for the suggestion, but before she could move, Chen exploded. "Don't you dare tell my wife what to do. You don't know anything about anything, little girl. You think that uniform makes you tough? You think you can come into my house and give orders?" He took a step toward Sarah, his fists clenched and his face twisted with rage. Williams immediately moved to intercept, but in the confined space of the living room, there wasn't much room to maneuver. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She created space, kept her hands visible but ready, and focused on Chen's center of mass rather than his face. She had studied enough domestic violence cases to know that alcohol, shame, and pride created a dangerous combination, especially when the perpetrator felt cornered. "Sir, I understand you're upset," Sarah said in a calm, steady voice. "But threatening a federal officer isn't going to help your situation. Let's all take a step back and figure out how to resolve this peacefully." Chen laughed, but it was an ugly sound with no humor in it. "Federal officer? You're a joke. I've served 3 tours in combat zones, little girl. I've seen things that would send you running home to mommy. And you're going to tell me how to handle my business?" The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah could see Williams reaching for his radio to call for backup. But backup was at least 10 minutes away, and she could see in Chen's eyes that he was past the point of rational thought. Something was going to happen, and it was going to happen soon. What happened next would change everything Sarah thought she knew about being a Marine, about respect, and about the kinds of battles that could be won without firing a shot. But, in that moment, standing in a cramped living room with an angry drunk advancing on her, all she could do was trust her training and hope that her first real test as a military police officer wouldn't also be her last. Mrs. Chen pulled her daughter closer, both of them pressed against the kitchen doorway, and Sarah realized that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't just about her anymore. There were other people depending on her to handle this right, and failure wasn't an option she was willing to consider. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. This was nothing like the controlled scenarios they had practiced in training. This was real, messy, and dangerous, and there was no instructor standing by to stop the exercise if things went wrong. Chen took another step forward, and Sarah knew that the next few seconds would determine not just the outcome of this call, but possibly her entire future as a Marine. The standoff in the Chen living room stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Staff Sergeant Chen swayed slightly, his alcohol-fueled rage making his movements unpredictable and dangerous. Sarah could see Williams tense beside her, his hand moving slowly toward his weapon, but she held up her left hand slightly, a subtle signal for him to wait. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, "I can see you're hurting. And I can see you're angry. But your daughter is watching, and she's scared. Is this really how you want her to remember her father?" Chen's eyes flicked toward the kitchen doorway where his daughter stood frozen, and, for a moment, something human flickered across his face. But then, the anger returned, stronger than before. "Don't you dare use my family against me," he snarled. "You don't know anything about being a parent, about the pressure, about what it's like to come back from 3 tours and try to pretend everything's normal." Sarah saw the pain behind the rage, the same pain she had seen in her own father's eyes years ago. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it gave her a way to reach him. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't know what that's like. But I know what it's like to be the kid in the corner, watching the person she loves most tear himself apart because he doesn't know how else to deal with what he's been through." The room went completely silent except for the sound of Chen's heavy breathing. Williams looked at Sarah with surprise, realizing she was taking a huge risk by getting personal with a volatile subject. "My father served 2 tours in Iraq," Sarah continued, taking a small step back to give Chen more space but keeping her voice conversational. "When he came home, he tried to drink away everything he'd seen. My mom tried to help, but she didn't know how. And my brother and we just tried to stay out of the way and hope things would get better." Chen's fists unclenched slightly, but his body remained rigid with tension. "Did they?" he asked despite himself. "Get better, I mean." "Eventually," Sarah said. "But not until he got help. Not until he stopped trying to handle everything alone and let people who cared about him actually help." For a moment, it seemed like Sarah's words might be getting through. Chen's shoulders sagged slightly, and he looked over at his wife and daughter with something that might have been shame. But then, he shook his head violently, as if trying to clear away unwelcome thoughts. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, his voice rising again. "Think you've got it all figured out? Well, here's a newsflash, rookie, some things can't be fixed with a heart-to-heart chat. Some things are broken for good." He lunged forward suddenly, not at Sarah but toward the coffee table where a half-empty beer bottle sat. Williams moved to intercept him, but Chen was faster than his intoxicated state suggested. He grabbed the bottle and spun around, holding it by the neck like a club. "Everyone just back off," he shouted. "Get out of my house." Mrs. Chen screamed and pulled her daughter fully into the kitchen, and Sarah heard the child start to cry. The sound seemed to cut through Chen like a knife, and his face contorted with a mixture of rage and anguish. "Look what you've done," he yelled at the MPs, "look what you've done to my family." Sarah realized that Chen was spiraling completely out of control, and that traditional de-escalation wasn't going to work. He was too drunk, too angry, and too ashamed to think clearly. She needed to change the dynamic entirely, and she needed to do it fast. "Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice taking on the tone of command she had learned in training, "put the bottle down and step back." "That's an order." Chen laughed bitterly. "An order? From you? You're nothing. A nobody. A rookie who doesn't know enough to be afraid when she should be." "You're right," Sarah said, surprising everyone in the room. "I am a rookie. I don't have combat experience. I haven't been tested under fire. But I do know one thing: right now, in this moment, your family needs you to be the Marine they can be proud of, not the broken man you think you are." Williams was reaching for his radio again, clearly thinking the situation was about to explode into violence, but Sarah continued. "I've read your file, Staff Sergeant. Bronze Star with V device for Valor. Purple Heart. Commendation medals. You're a decorated combat veteran who has saved lives and served with distinction. But, right now, you're letting alcohol and pain turn you into someone your daughter is afraid of." Chen's hand shook as he held the bottle, and Sarah could see tears mixing with the sweat on his face. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "The things I've seen, the things I've done. How am I supposed to come home and pretend to be normal? How am I supposed to be a father when I can't even sleep through the night without seeing their faces?" Sarah felt her heart break a little for this man who was clearly drowning in trauma and guilt. But she also knew that his pain didn't give him the right to terrorize his family. "You don't have to pretend to be normal," she said gently. "You just have to be willing to get help. Your family doesn't need you to be perfect, Staff Sergeant. They need you to be present. They need you to fight for them the same way you fought for your fellow Marines overseas." The bottle slipped from Chen's hand and crashed to the floor, sending beer and glass fragments across the hardwood. He collapsed into an armchair and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Williams immediately moved to secure the scene while Sarah knelt down carefully near Chen, staying far enough away to avoid startling him but close enough to offer comfort. "It's okay," she said quietly. "The hardest part is over. Now we can get you the help you need." The rest of the call proceeded smoothly. Backup arrived and helped escort Chen to the base medical facility for evaluation and treatment. Mrs. Chen was connected with family advocacy services, and arrangements were made for temporary housing until Chen completed an alcohol treatment program. As they drove back to the MP station, Williams was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, he spoke up. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Talk to him like that. Get him to back down without anyone getting hurt." Sarah stared out the window at the passing base housing, thinking about her answer. "I learned it from watching my father struggle," she said finally. "And from watching what happened when people gave up on him too early. Sometimes the people who seem the most dangerous are really just the most scared." Williams nodded slowly. "That was good work, Martinez. Really good work." Word of the Chen incident spread quickly through the MP unit, as word always did on a military base. By the next morning, Sarah found herself the subject of conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, most of them expressing surprise that the little rookie had handled such a volatile situation with skill and maturity. But not everyone was impressed. Sergeant Johnson made his feelings clear when he called Sarah into his office the following afternoon. "I hear you played therapist with Staff Sergeant Chen yesterday," he said without preamble. "I followed established de-escalation procedures, Sergeant," Sarah replied carefully. "Did you? Because from what I heard, you got pretty personal with a drunk and disorderly subject. That's not procedure, Martinez. That's gambling with your safety and the safety of your partner." Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her voice level. "The situation required adaptation, Sergeant. Standard procedures weren't working, and the subject was escalating toward violence." Johnson leaned back in his chair and studied her with obvious skepticism. "You know what your problem is, Martinez? You think you're special. You think because you graduated at the top of your class and because you managed not to get yourself killed on one domestic call, you know better than people who have been doing this job since before you were born." The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth to it. Sarah did believe she could make a difference, did believe that her education and training gave her tools that older, more cynical MPs might not have. But she also knew that Johnson's criticism came from a place of experience she couldn't ignore. "I'm here to learn, Sergeant," she said. "But I'm also here to do the job to the best of my ability. If that means adapting to situations as they develop, then that's what I'll do." Johnson's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Martinez. That sounds an awful lot like insubordination. You may have impressed Corporal Williams, but you haven't impressed me. As far as I'm concerned, you're still an unproven rookie who got lucky once." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself even more deeply into her work, determined to prove that the Chen incident wasn't just beginner's luck. She studied case files, attended every available training session, and volunteered for the most challenging assignments. But Johnson seemed determined to keep her relegated to desk work and routine tasks. "He's testing you," Corporal Peterson explained one afternoon as they worked together updating evidence logs. "Johnson does this with every rookie who shows promise. He figures if you can't handle his hazing, you won't be able to handle real pressure when it matters." Sarah appreciated the explanation, but it didn't make the situation any less frustrating. She had joined the military to make a difference, to serve with honor like her brother had, not to spend her days filing paperwork while more experienced MPs handled the real police work. Her opportunity to prove herself came 3 weeks later, during what started as a routine patrol of the base perimeter. Sarah was partnered with Corporal Foster, a steady veteran who had grudgingly begun to respect her dedication if not her experience. They were checking access points along the eastern fence line when Foster spotted something unusual near one of the maintenance gates. "Martinez, you see that," he said, pointing toward a section of fence where the chain link appeared to be damaged. Sarah looked through the binoculars and felt her stomach drop. Someone had cut through the fence, creating an opening large enough for a person to crawl through. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt suggested the breach was recent. "Should we call it in?" Sarah asked, reaching for her radio. "Not yet," Foster said grimly. "We need to assess the situation first. Could be nothing, could be something serious. Either way, we need more information before we sound any alarms." They approached the fence carefully, weapons ready but not drawn. The breach was definitely recent. The cut edges of the chain link were still bright silver, not yet dulled by weather or rust. Someone had used heavy-duty wire cutters and had known exactly where to cut to avoid the base's security sensors. "This is professional work," Foster muttered, examining the breach more closely. "Not some drunk Marine trying to sneak back onto base. Someone planned this." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the implications. An unauthorized breach of base security could mean anything from smuggling to espionage to terrorism. And they had stumbled onto it during what was supposed to be a routine patrol. "Footprints," Sarah said, pointing to the soft earth on the base side of the fence. "At least 2 people, maybe 3. They came through sometime last night, I'd guess." Foster nodded, his expression grim. "We need backup, and we need it now. This is way beyond our pay grade." As he reached for his radio, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. The sound of approaching footsteps, multiple sets, coming from the direction of the main base. Someone was coming back to the breach point, and Sarah and Foster were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. The next few minutes would test everything Sarah had learned about being a Marine, about courage under pressure, and about the kind of split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But she had no way of knowing that her actions in those crucial moments would bring her to the attention of someone whose opinion would change her life forever. The footsteps were getting closer, and Sarah could hear low voices speaking in what sounded like a foreign language. Foster grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a concrete utility building about 20 yards away, but they were still too exposed. If whoever was approaching reached the fence breach, they would be spotted immediately. Sarah's mind raced through their options. They could retreat and call for backup, but that would mean losing contact with what could be enemy infiltrators. They could attempt to confront the intruders, but they were outnumbered and had no idea what kind of weapons or training they were dealing with. Or they could try to observe and gather intelligence while staying hidden. Foster was clearly thinking along the same lines. "We need to get eyes on them without being seen," he whispered. "If these are hostile actors, command needs to know what we're dealing with." They made it to the utility building just as three figures emerged from the scrub brush beyond the perimeter fence. Even from a distance, Sarah could see they were dressed in dark clothing and moving with the kind of disciplined coordination that suggested military or paramilitary training. "Definitely not lost hikers," Foster muttered, raising his binoculars. The lead figure was a tall man with what appeared to be Middle Eastern features, carrying a large backpack and scanning the area with professional wariness. The other two were younger, possibly in their 20s, and they moved with the nervous energy of people who knew they were someplace they shouldn't be. Sarah watched through her own binoculars as the three men approached the fence breach. The leader examined the opening carefully, checking for signs that it had been discovered, while the other two kept watch in both directions. "They're coming through," Foster whispered. "And they look like they know exactly where they're going." As the intruders crawled through the fence breach, Sarah caught sight of something that made her stomach drop. The leader's jacket fell open slightly, revealing what appeared to be the handle of a knife or small gun tucked into his waistband. These weren't refugees or asylum seekers, they were armed infiltrators on a United States military installation. Foster was already reaching for his radio when the leader suddenly froze and held up his hand, stopping his companions. He had spotted something, tire tracks from their patrol vehicle, or perhaps footprints from their approach to the fence. His head turned slowly as he scanned the area, and Sarah realized with growing horror that his gaze was moving directly toward their hiding spot. "He knows we're here," she breathed. The leader said something sharp to his companions, and all three men immediately spread out and began moving with the efficient precision of trained soldiers. Sarah and Foster were about to be flanked, and their concrete shelter would become a trap rather than protection. "We need to move," Foster said urgently. "Now." But, as they prepared to relocate, Sarah heard the distant sound of another vehicle approaching from the direction of the main base. A glance over her shoulder showed a single Humvee heading their way, probably routine security making their scheduled rounds. The timing couldn't have been worse. "Foster, if that patrol drives into this situation blind, they're going to be sitting ducks," Sarah said. "Those intruders are armed and positioned to ambush anyone who comes down that road." Foster's face was grim as he realized the implications. "We can't reach them on radio without alerting the infiltrators to our presence. And we can't abandon our position without losing visual contact." Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her instructors but felt absolutely right in the moment. "Cover me," she said, and, before Foster could object, she was sprinting from their concealment toward a position where she could intercept the approaching patrol. The lead infiltrator spotted her immediately and shouted something to his companions. Sarah heard the sound of running feet behind her as she dove behind a concrete barrier near the road. Bullets sparked off the concrete near her head, and she realized these weren't just infiltrators, they were professionals willing to kill to complete their mission. The approaching Humvee's engine grew louder, and Sarah knew she had only seconds to warn them before they drove into the kill zone. She keyed her radio and began broadcasting on the emergency frequency. All units, this is MP Martinez at grid reference 7749. We have armed hostile infiltrators on base, repeat, armed hostiles on base. Patrol vehicle approaching from the west needs to abort approach immediately." The response was immediate and chaotic. Multiple voices began talking at once, demanding clarification and status reports. But, over the radio chatter, Sarah heard the sound she had been hoping for, the Humvee's engine changing pitch as the driver hit the brakes. More gunfire erupted from the infiltrators' position, and Sarah realized they were now caught between her position and Foster's, exactly where they didn't want to be. The element of surprise was gone, but so was their tactical advantage. "Martinez, what's your status?" came Sergeant Johnson's voice over the radio, tight with concern and anger. "Three armed infiltrators breached the perimeter fence at grid 7749, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady as bullets continued to snap overhead. "They're armed with small arms, possibly other weapons." Corporal Foster is in position to observe but needs immediate backup. Roger that. QRF is en route, ETA 5 minutes. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. 5 minutes felt like an eternity as Sarah huddled behind her concrete barrier, listening to the sound of movement as the infiltrators tried to maneuver around her position. She could hear Foster occasionally checking in on the radio, providing updates on their movements, but she couldn't see him from her current position. Then, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching from different directions. For a moment, she thought reinforcements had arrived early, but the engines didn't sound right. Too quiet, too well maintained. These weren't military vehicles. Foster, are you seeing this? She called over the radio. Negative, I can't see the road from my position. What do you have? Before Sarah could respond, 3 black SUVs rounded the bend in the road, moving fast and heading directly toward the fence breach. The infiltrators hadn't been trying to get onto the base, they had been trying to get something off it. All units, we have multiple civilian vehicles approaching the breach site, Sarah broadcast. This appears to be an exfiltration operation, not an infiltration. The SUVs screeched to a halt near the fence breach, and Sarah watched in amazement as a dozen more armed men poured out of the vehicles. They moved with military precision, establishing a perimeter and providing cover while the original 3 infiltrators began moving back toward the fence. They're extracting, Foster's voice crackled over the radio. Whatever they came here for, they got it. Sarah realized she was witnessing something far more serious than a simple security breach. This was a coordinated intelligence operation, probably foreign, designed to steal classified information or technology from the base. And she and Foster had stumbled into the middle of it. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, and Sarah looked up to see 2 Apache gunships heading their way. The quick reaction force would include air support, which meant the infiltrators were about to find themselves seriously outgunned. But the enemy operatives had clearly planned for this contingency. As the helicopters approached, Sarah saw several of them raise what appeared to be shoulder-fired missiles. Air support, break off, she screamed into her radio. They have anti-aircraft weapons. The lead Apache pilot must have heard the warning, because both helicopters immediately banked hard to the right, narrowly avoiding the missiles that streaked past them. But the distraction gave the infiltrators the time they needed to reach their vehicles. Sarah made another split-second decision that would either save lives or get her court-martialed. She broke from her covered position and began sprinting toward the lead SUV, hoping to at least get close enough to see faces or license plates that could help identify the attackers. Gunfire erupted behind her as the enemy operatives tried to stop her advance, but she zigzagged and used every piece of cover available. She was almost close enough to read the license plate when a figure stepped out from behind one of the SUVs and leveled a rifle directly at her. Sarah dove to the ground and rolled behind a drainage ditch, certain she was about to die. But, instead of gunfire, she heard the distinctive crack of an American sniper rifle, and the enemy operative spun around and collapsed. "Martinez, stay down," came a new voice over the radio, one she didn't recognize but which carried the unmistakable authority of serious rank. "Overwatch has you covered." The firefight that followed was brief but intense. The quick reaction force arrived in full strength, supported by the Apache gunships and what appeared to be additional sniper teams that had been pre-positioned around the area. The enemy operatives fought professionally but were clearly outmatched. When the shooting stopped, 2 of the SUVs had managed to escape, but the third was disabled and its occupants were either dead or wounded. Sarah lay in her drainage ditch, ears ringing from the gunfire and adrenaline coursing through her system. "Martinez, Foster, sound off," came Sergeant Johnson's voice over the radio. "Martinez here, I'm okay," Sarah replied, slowly raising her head to assess the situation. "Foster here, also okay. Good shooting by whoever had our backs." As Sarah climbed out of the drainage ditch, she saw military vehicles converging on the scene from all directions. MPs, infantry, explosive ordnance disposal teams, and personnel she couldn't immediately identify were securing the area and beginning their investigation. But what caught her attention was a single figure standing near one of the Humvees, watching her with obvious interest. Even from a distance, she could see the stars on his collar and the bearing that marked him as senior command. This wasn't just any officer, this was someone important enough to personally respond to a security incident. Martinez. Sergeant Johnson's voice made her turn around. He was approaching at a rapid walk, his face showing a mixture of anger, concern, and something that might have been respect. "What the hell were you thinking out there?" Before Sarah could answer, the senior officer began walking toward them, and she realized that her actions during the firefight were about to be reviewed by someone who could make or break her military career with a single word. As the figure drew closer, Sarah recognized the insignia and felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just any general, this was someone whose reputation preceded him, someone whose mere presence on the scene meant this incident was far more serious than she had initially realized. Whatever happened next would determine not just her future in the military police, but her entire future as a Marine. And she had no idea whether her split-second decisions during the firefight would be seen as heroic initiative or dangerous insubordination. The general who approached was not what Sarah had expected. Despite his obvious seniority and the deference shown by everyone around him, he moved with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time in combat zones than behind a desk. His uniform bore the markings of Marine Force Recon, and there was something about his eyes that suggested he had seen more action than most Marines would experience in a lifetime. "Lance Corporal Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm General Morrison. I understand you were the first to spot the breach and coordinate the initial response." Sarah came to attention immediately, her heart pounding. She had heard stories about General Morrison, a legend in Marine circles, known for his unconventional tactics and his ability to appear wherever the action was hottest. His presence here meant this incident was far more significant than a simple security breach. "Yes, sir. Corporal Foster and I were conducting routine perimeter patrol when we discovered the fence breach." General Morrison studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Around them, the cleanup operation continued with military efficiency. The disabled SUV was being processed by intelligence specialists, while medical teams attended to the wounded enemy operatives. The whole scene had the organized chaos of a major incident. "Your radio calls probably saved lives today," the general said finally. "The patrol you warned off would have driven straight into an ambush. And your warning about the anti-aircraft weapons allowed our air support to adjust their approach." "Thank you, sir." Sarah wasn't sure what else to say. She was still processing everything that had happened, still trying to understand why a general had responded personally to what started as a routine patrol. However, Morrison continued, his tone becoming more serious. "Your decision to break cover and approach the enemy vehicles was extremely dangerous and potentially compromised our sniper team's ability to provide overwatch." Sarah felt her stomach sink. She had acted on instinct, trying to gather intelligence that might help identify the attackers, but she realized now that her actions could have interfered with a larger operation she knew nothing about. "Sir, I was attempting to gather visual confirmation of the attackers' identities for intelligence purposes," she said carefully. "I understand your reasoning, Lance Corporal. But, in the future, remember that initiative and recklessness are not the same thing. Today you were lucky. Next time, you might not be." Before Sarah could respond, Sergeant Johnson approached and saluted. "General, if I may, Lance Corporal Martinez has shown exceptional judgment in previous situations. This is the same Marine who successfully de-escalated a potentially violent domestic situation 3 weeks ago using techniques that probably prevented serious injury or death." Sarah looked at Johnson in surprise. She had assumed he disapproved of her methods and considered her too inexperienced for real police work. General Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so? Tell me about that incident, Sergeant." As Johnson recounted the Chen situation, describing Sarah's ability to connect with a traumatized veteran and talk him down from violence, Sarah began to understand that she was being evaluated for something beyond her actions during the firefight. "Interesting," Morrison said when Johnson finished his account. "Sergeant, how would you assess Lance Corporal Martinez's overall performance since she arrived at your unit?" Johnson glanced at Sarah, and she was surprised to see something that looked like approval in his eyes. Sir, she has consistently exceeded expectations. She works harder than anyone else in the unit, she studies every case file like it's a military manual, and she's shown the ability to adapt and think on her feet under pressure. I may have questioned some of her methods initially, but I can't argue with her results. Sarah felt a surge of unexpected emotion at Johnson's words. She had spent weeks thinking he considered her a liability, when apparently he had been watching and evaluating her progress all along. General Morrison nodded slowly. Lance Corporal, are you familiar with the Military Police Special Operations Unit? Sarah's heart skipped a beat. MP SPOPS was an elite unit that handled the most sensitive law enforcement operations within the military. Getting selected for SPOPS was considered the pinnacle of an MP's career, and most Marines had to serve years before even being considered for evaluation. Yes, sir. I'm familiar with the unit's reputation. They're always looking for Marines who can think independently, handle pressure, and connect with people in crisis situations. Based on what I've observed today and what your sergeant tells me about your previous performance, you might be someone they'd be interested in evaluating. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. 3 months ago, she had been a rookie fresh out of training, and now a general was discussing the possibility of her joining an elite unit. Sir, I would be honored to be considered for such an opportunity, she managed to say. Morrison smiled slightly. Don't get ahead of yourself, Lance Corporal. There's a significant difference between showing promise and proving you can handle the responsibilities of special operations work. But, if you're interested, I can arrange for you to meet with someone who can tell you more about what's involved. As if summoned by the general's words, another figure approached from the direction of the command vehicles. This was a woman, probably in her early 30s, wearing the uniform of a Marine major but with insignia Sarah didn't recognize. She moved with the same quiet confidence as the general, and there was something about her bearing that suggested significant combat experience. Lance Corporal Martinez, General Morrison said, I'd like you to meet Major Reynolds. She's currently assigned to a joint task force that deals with specialized law enforcement situations. Major Reynolds extended her hand, and Sarah was surprised by the firmness of her grip. I've been watching the aftermath of today's incident, she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't place. Your actions during the firefight show the kind of initiative we look for in our unit. Thank you, ma'am. However, initiative is only part of what we need. We deal with situations that require not just quick thinking and courage, but the ability to operate independently in environments where traditional military support may not be available. Are you interested in learning more? Sarah looked around at the organized chaos surrounding them, at the evidence of a complex intelligence operation that had played out on her base, at the faces of Marines who had responded with professional competence to a serious security threat. This was the kind of work she had dreamed of when she decided to join the military, meaningful, challenging, and directly connected to protecting national security. Yes, ma'am. I'm very interested. Major Reynolds nodded. Good. Report to Building 247 at 0800 tomorrow. Bring your complete service record and be prepared for a comprehensive evaluation. This isn't just about your performance today, we'll be looking at every aspect of your training, your psychological profile, and your potential for advanced operations. As Major Reynolds walked away, General Morrison turned back to Sarah. Lance Corporal, a word of advice. What happened here today was classified at the highest levels. You will not discuss the details of this incident with anyone who was not directly involved, and you will refer any questions about it to your commanding officer. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Good. And, Martinez? Morrison paused as he prepared to leave. Whatever else happens, remember that you handled yourself well today. Your quick thinking and courage under fire reflect well on your unit and on the Corps. Sergeant Johnson should be proud to have you on his team. After the general left, Sarah found herself standing with Johnson and Foster, trying to process everything that had happened. The cleanup operation continued around them, but the immediate drama of the firefight had given way to the methodical work of investigation and evidence collection. So, Foster said finally, how does it feel to go from rookie to special operations candidate in the space of a few hours? Sarah laughed, feeling some of the tension drain out of her system. Surreal. This morning I was worried about whether Sergeant Johnson thought I could handle routine patrol work. Johnson snorted. Martinez, I've been testing you since the day you arrived. The paperwork, the domestic calls, the attitude, all of it was designed to see how you'd respond under pressure and whether you'd let setbacks discourage you from doing the job. And? Sarah asked. And, you passed every test I threw at you. The Chen incident proved you could think on your feet and connect with people in crisis. Today proved you could handle yourself in a combat situation. I don't know what this special task force does, but if they're smart, they'll grab you before someone else does. As they walked back toward their patrol vehicle, Sarah reflected on the strange turns her military career had taken. 3 months ago, she had been a nervous rookie hoping to prove herself worthy of wearing the uniform. Now she was being considered for assignment to a unit she had only heard whispered about in MP circles. One thing I don't understand, Foster said as they drove back toward the MP station. How did General Morrison happen to be here so quickly? I mean, we called in the incident maybe 20 minutes before he showed up. Johnson and Foster exchanged a look that Sarah caught in the rearview mirror. What? She asked. Martinez, Johnson said carefully, I think today's incident might have been more than just a random security breach. The speed of the response, the fact that we had sniper teams and air support positions so quickly, the general's personal involvement, it all suggests this was something people were expecting. Sarah thought about the professional way the infiltrators had moved, their coordination with the extraction team, the sophisticated equipment they had carried. You think we were being used as bait? I think, Johnson said slowly, that someone knew this base was being targeted, and they were waiting for the attackers to make their move. You and Foster just happened to be in the right place at the right time to spot them. The implications of that realization were sobering. If Johnson was right, then Sarah's performance during the incident hadn't just been evaluated by her immediate supervisors, it had been observed by intelligence professionals who specialized in exactly the kind of work she might soon be asked to do. As they pulled into the MP station parking lot, Sarah saw a familiar figure waiting by the entrance. It was Corporal Williams, and he was holding what appeared to be new orders. Martinez, he called out as she got out of the patrol vehicle, you're wanted in the commander's office immediately. And these came for you while you were out. He handed her an official-looking envelope marked with the seal of Marine Corps Headquarters. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers and read the brief message inside. She was being temporarily assigned to a classified unit for evaluation and possible permanent transfer, effective immediately. She had 24 hours to complete her current duties and report to the address Major Reynolds had given her. Well, she said to Johnson and Foster, who were reading over her shoulder, I guess this is really happening. You'll do fine, Johnson said, and she was surprised to hear what sounded like genuine affection in his voice. Just remember what you learned here, and don't let anyone convince you that being young or inexperienced means you can't do the job. As Sarah walked toward the commander's office, she thought about the promise she had made to herself when she joined the military, to serve with the same honor and dedication her brother had shown. Today, for the first time since putting on the uniform, she felt like she was finally living up to that promise. Whatever challenges lay ahead with the Special Operations Unit, whatever tests and evaluations awaited her, she would face them with the confidence that came from knowing she had proven herself when it mattered most. She was no longer the uncertain rookie who had stepped off the transport bus 3 months ago. She was a Marine who had faced combat, saved lives, and earned the respect of her peers and superiors. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve. But tonight, Sarah Martinez could finally sleep with the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly the work she was meant to do. The young woman who had once been dismissed as just another rookie had found her place among the elite, and she would carry the callsign Iron Wolf with the same pride and determination that had brought her to this moment.